Well, first of all, let me just say that it feels really good to Homer and enter the stage in this special way. It's great to be with all of you tonight. I've come to the conclusion that somebody in the leadership of the Harvard College China Forum doesn't like me because Mr. Chu is an incredibly difficult act to follow. And it's going to be tough, but I will give it my best shot. I'm really honored to be here. It is a great privilege to be a part of such a distinguished group of speakers and to take part in an incredible event. And I salute the students, the organizers, the leadership, the faculty and staff, and all of those who were part of making this incredible conference happen. I want to talk about the U.S.-China relationship, but I want to come at it from a slightly different angle than perhaps we often do. A lot of times we think about the headlines in the U.S.-China relationship: McCarthy, Tsai, TikTok, Xi Jinping traveling to Russia, the balloon, which, as I pointed out, added even more hot air to discourse in this country about the U.S.-China relationship, Taiwan, and the list goes on. But the point that I want to make is that, in reality, there are some deeper currents in the relationship that drive a lot of the tension and the contradictions that we see in the relationship between the United States and China. And I don't think that we talk about those issues enough. And so this evening I want to spend a little time talking about not an exhaustive list, but a pretty good accounting of what I think are the underlying problems in the relationship, of which the specific headline of the day, more often than not, is a manifestation or a symptom. So the four things that I want to talk about in my remarks this evening are: number one, the structural issues; number two, doctrinal tensions; number three, political considerations; and number four, the issue of factuality, which may sound like an odd thing to talk about, but you'll see what I mean when we get to that. And I hope this helps us get under the hood of this really vitally important relationship, a relationship that I think all of us would agree is the most consequential bilateral relationship in the world today, and I would add, the most consequential bilateral relationship in the history of the world. And we have to get it right because the consequences of getting it wrong are very unpleasant and far-reaching. Well, let me say a few words about what I see as a profound structural tension in the relationship between the United States and China. And it relates to something that I refer to as the twin truths, and we might say the twin inconvenient truths of this relationship. And that is this: when looking at the United States through the lens of China, the United States seems to be the only country in the world that has the potential to end Communist Party leadership in China once and for all, as viewed from a Beijing perspective. I'm not saying that that is the desire, the stated desire, or the desire of the United States, but if you look at U.S. capabilities through a Chinese lens, if you look at rhetoric that comes out of Washington and out of this country through a Chinese lens that goes to the issue of intentions, and you take the capabilities and intentions and put them together, it looks pretty daunting. And it creates a kind of primal angst, or I would even say primal fear, that this is a country that could do significant harm to China, the United States. And that generates a kind of existential level of concern that seeps through everything in the relationship and everything in the mindset of policymakers in China. Now, if we flip it around and look at China through the lens of the United States, China is the one country in the world that has the capacity, and in the view of some, may have the intention to make American life worse for pretty much everyone in this country by virtue of its actions and policies, whether, according to this argument, with respect to technological competition, whether with respect to the issue of jobs and outsourcing, whether with respect to competing with the United States in areas that we regard as our comparative advantages, whether with respect to AI, which is now a very profoundly important area of research and science and entrepreneurship, quantum physics, and the list goes on. The fact is, these two countries have the capability of hurting each other. That is what the perception is in the two countries when we look across. Now, whether that is justified or not justified, one can debate. But the idea that there is this structural twin reality, that these are countries that can hurt each other, is a structural issue in the relationship. It colors how both countries look at the relationship. It colors decision-making. And in the end, it's a tension, it generates a tension that is never going to go away. So we have a structural issue in the relationship that I think we don't talk about enough. But we need to, and I think we need to air it out and surface it, along with all these other issues and others that I may even not get into in this talk, so that we can understand what we're dealing with and hopefully get to a better place. The second layer, if you will, that I want to talk about is the doctrinal layer. And this is pretty straightforward and also pretty profound and basic. And that is, if you look at United States national security doctrine, the fact is the United States says very clearly that we seek to attain primacy and supremacy in the world. That's actually what we say in not so many words, but pretty close to those words in our national security strategy, published every 4 years. And it goes back a long time. The idea is that the United States aspires to be the biggest, the baddest, the toughest, the most powerful, and the most able to impose our will on the world of any country out there. That's what we say that we want to do. Now, China's doctrine is very different. China's doctrine is interpreted in different ways, but at a minimum, China's doctrine is that China seeks to be one pole in a multipolar world where power is diffused and where there are 5 or 6 co-equal poles, co-equal power players that have more or less equivalent or equal ability to shape outcomes in the world. And so as a result, China wants to be co-equal with the United States at a minimum. It wants to be co-equal with Europe as a whole. It wants to be co-equal with arguably Russia, Japan, India, or the other pole players who are the main players in the world in terms of ability to impact events and developments. So as soon as you see those two doctrines up against each other, what you realize is that the two doctrines are fundamentally incompatible. The United States seeks to be number one, and China doesn't want to be number two. And that problem never goes away because, in my judgment, in my lifetime, and probably that of all of us here, we're never going to see the United States fundamentally look at its role, its self-defined role in the world differently. Nor are we going to see China turn around one day and say, you know what, I would really like to be second place in the world for a long time to come. The next point I want to make, and I may go a couple of minutes over, but thank you for showing me that. I won't go too long, and I will pay attention, is the political level. I want to say a few things about this. It seems to me that politics have become the principal driver of each country's approach to the other. And I think that is especially pronounced in the United States. Both sides, and again, especially the United States, seem to find it easier to focus on a foreign boogeyman or baddie, if we can use that term, than to actually sit down and do the hard work of solving our own country's actual problems. And we see that a lot in the United States. I think we arguably see it to a certain degree in China, but I think the phenomenon is more pronounced here than it is anywhere else. And what has happened is that a kind of orthodoxy has set in this country, politically, out of Washington, on a bipartisan basis, that basically posits that China and, as it's often referred to in Washington, quote, the CCP, unquote, is basically the root of all evil in the world. That's what this narrative says. That everything China does is bad, sinister, nefarious, wrong, and basically bent on the destruction of America. That is the narrative that has taken hold in Washington and across a significant swath of our country. It reminds me of the old line, how do you know so-and-so is lying when his lips are moving? And I think that to take that phrase and apply it to China, it's as if someone is saying, how do you know that China's doing something wrong? And the answer from this group is, when it's doing something. That's basically the mindset that we have in this country. If China's doing it, then it must be wrong. That's what a significant swath of this country believes. That's what virtually all of Washington, at least in the legislative branch, and some voices in the executive branch seem to think. It is a perverse tautology, and it's very unhealthy for this relationship and for America. And for reasons I'll mention in a second, it takes us down a path that ends up being skewed and off target because we're fundamentally misassessing the situation. So politically, we have a race to the rhetorical bottom, and one that ends up generating a kind of ratchet effect, because when politician A comes and says China is bad, politician B comes and says, I strongly disagree. No, China's much worse than what you're saying. And as a result, it ratchets in a particular direction of vitriol and hyperbole, and ultimately, as I'll talk about in a second, in some cases, a departure from factual reality. So this is a serious problem in the relationship, and I'm sad to say that I'm not particularly optimistic that this problem is going to get resolved any quicker than the other ones that I just mentioned, or the ones that I will mention. But I will say this before I move on to the last topic and then my conclusion, and that is that, in my judgment, if the leadership of the United States spent 1/20th of the time that we spend demonizing China actually working to solve the problems of this country, we would probably have a pretty good percentage of them licked by now. But that is not generally happening, because it's a lot easier and more politically expedient to beat up on the foreign baddie than it is to actually do your job and find solutions for this country. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is factuality. Mr. Euler made some really important points about seeking the truth from facts, if I can put it that way, about the importance of facts and logic in making decisions. And I'm sad to say that one thing that I think we see in the U.S.-China relationship today that is very problematic in my judgment is a mirroring of the phenomenon that we see in the United States itself. And it relates to three interrelated problems around factuality. Number one, the United States and China often simply don't agree on the same set of facts. And I'm not talking about having different opinions. I'm talking about we do not agree that what you think are facts, and vice versa. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Secondly, and I'm probably the first person, I think, to use this particular phrase and construct in the context of U.S.-China relations. We gaslight each other a lot. What does that mean? It means that I sit here in front of you and tell you something that you know isn't true, and that I know isn't true, and you do the same thing back to me. Talking about the United States and China, and we say things to each other that just aren't true. And they're demonstrably false, but we say them as if they were true. And finally, in terms of factuality, particularly with respect to U.S. discourse, our discourse about China has to an alarming and I would say almost shocking degree, in some instances become divorced from factual reality. Now let me just say a little bit more about these, because these are really important points. On many issues, the United States and China simply don't agree that facts are facts. When the United States states something to China as a fact, China's response is, what you just said is factually false, and demonstrably so, and vice versa. So think about what that means in a relationship. We talk about the importance of communication, and Mr. Chu very rightly pointed out the importance of listening as a core element of communication. But when you're listening to things that you know are untrue, the impact and effect of that communication is likely to be negligible to nil. On a related note, this issue of gaslighting, we, the United States government, the Chinese government, do say things to each other that just are not true. I'll give you one example from each side. The United States says to China, and I'm one of the few people that's said this publicly and prolifically over the last couple of years, the United States says to China that our policy toward Taiwan hasn't changed. Well, guess what? It has. It has changed. And when the Chinese say that it's changed, they're actually right. But we sit there and say, as a matter of record, you can look it up, our one China policy, our approach to Taiwan, our approach to China remains unchanged. That's the set phrase. Well, that's not true. And one could cite any number of specific data points to substantiate that. Meanwhile, when China talks about its own internal situation, its human rights picture, whether in Xinjiang or whether with respect to Hong Kong, or talks about the South China Sea, it often makes statements to the United States that U.S. observers understand to be false. And so the point that I would make is, when we treat each other this way, what do you think the impact is on credibility and on trust? It's a corrosive, damaging impact, and it seeps through the entirety of U.S.-China discourse. And I'm almost done here. So the last thing I want to say about factuality, and then I'll conclude with just a couple of sentences, is if we can't embrace the same set of facts, tell the truth to each other, and ground our discourse in fact, in factual reality, how can we possibly aspire to get this relationship to a fundamentally different and better place? More broadly, I want to say one thing. It may be the most important thing that I say in my own mind, and that is, I think the greatest threat to America today, bar none, is the untethering of our political and public policy discourse from factual reality. And unless and until we fix that problem, the United States is never going to outcompete China, nor are we ever going to solve most of the fundamental problems that we have in this country. In conclusion, let me just say this. Over the coming days, we will see more headlines every day, almost every hour, about how bad things are in the U.S.-China relationship. But in many cases, those headlines are, in reality, manifestations and symptoms of much deeper maladies that we see in the relationship between the United States and China. I hope and believe that the Harvard College China Forum will serve as a catalyst, and I think I'm seeing it, and all of us are seeing it already, for finding ways to keep this vitally important relationship on the rails and maybe even moving it forward. I think all of us have a special responsibility to do all that we can to bestow to those who come after us a U.S.-China relationship that they want and need, and a future that they deserve. Thank you so much.